All right, so off we go with the recording. So, yeah, again, thanks so much for joining today. So, this is our kind of preliminary analysis of what we found over the last couple months, looking through the different weed risk assessments for Northeast states. Most of the folks who've been closely involved in this project are kind of listed along with me on this slide and are also on the Zoom today. So thanks very much kind of in advance. There's been a lot of, we've looked through a lot of documents through this process, and I really appreciate all of the time and thought and effort that that the team has gone to go through it. So as a reminder, last February, you guys might recall coming to Amherst, and it was a rainy, sleety day, and we sat in this kind of darkened room to talk about these ideas of trying to build a stronger regional collaboration, and think about different pieces of information that we could exchange that would help build that regional collaboration. And a lot of our motivation for the reason behind the need for regional collaboration is built on this idea that climate change is bringing new species in, and that we need to be better about regulating those species proactively. And that proactive kind of regulation and prevention isn't going to work effectively if only one state does it. We need all states to be working together. Otherwise, we end up with this kind of patchwork approach to regulation, which isn't going to help anyone in the long run. And so our pitch when we talked to you guys in February was, we know from the work that Jenica Allen has done that the Northeast is a hotspot of future plant invasions. So that's this graph or figure in the upper right corner. That many Northeast states are looking at upwards of 100 new species potentially coming by 2050. And that now is basically our opportunity to be proactive about preventing these species, that we are on the left side for these range shifting species, the left side of the invasion curve where prevention is actually possible, kind of amazingly, which we don't often have that opportunity, right, in invasion ecology and management. So we've got this opportunity to be proactive. The rest of our pitch was that we had looked at some of what the regulatory lists looked like now, and that we're really not being proactive in the Northeast. And so this graph, you may remember, is an analysis of how widespread, that is, what percent of counties within a state contain listed species. So if you're on the 100%, that means that listed species, that regulated species is already present in 100% of the counties within the state. If you're at 0, that means you're fully proactive, so that species isn't yet present in the state and is regulated. And so the dashed line in the middle here is actually the average across all the lower 48 states. So on average, for the lower 48 states, it's a little less than 50% of counties present for regulated species. You'll notice that most of the Northeast states were actually more reactive than the average across the lower 48, that most of our species that are listed tend to be pretty widespread. So that was our pitch, right? And then we had the discussion with you guys, and you told us, well, before we can start thinking about regional collaborations and sharing of information, or climate change proactive, we really need to know what our neighbors are doing, because we, you guys know your states really well, but not necessarily neighboring states particularly well. And so you asked us to kind of go through and report back on what the current state of weed risk assessment is for the Northeast states. And so here are the questions that we've been working on. The first is, how do weed risk assessments compare across Northeast states? And the second was digging into the species that have been evaluated and or regulated across the Northeast. What do those species lists look like? And the reason that we're talking today is we feel like we've got, some preliminary results for both of those two things, and we need your help figuring out and brainstorming, okay, what are the next steps? Where do we go from here? So the data sets that we had to work with were protocols. So the weed risk assessment protocols, that is, what were the criteria for listing species from all states except Rhode Island. So Rhode Island doesn't have a weed risk assessment that we can tell. And we also had the sort of specific risk assessments for a few hundred species across Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, and New York. We weren't able to find those for Connecticut or Vermont, and because Rhode Island doesn't have one, there weren't any of those. Maine has an asterisk here because Maine actually has two different protocols, one focused on regulatory analysis and one focused on management priorities. So for this one, just for comparability with the other states, we're just going to show the regulatory analysis for Maine. All right, so on to that first question, how do weed risk assessments compare among Northeast states? So one of the first things that comes out in terms of looking at the different weed risk assessments is that there are kind of two main mechanisms for assessment across the different states. One is more of a kind of binary criteria based, that is, you fit the criteria or you don't fit the criteria, and that would, make you more, higher up on the likelihood of invasive scale, the more of those criteria that you fit, versus a more kind of scoring based where for any given criteria, you could go from kind of a low score to a high score. So Massachusetts, for example, you can maybe kind of read some of the questions behind those, but in order to be considered as invasive, likely invasive, or potentially invasive, you first have to be non-native to Massachusetts, have the potential to be widespread, and a couple of other things that I can't actually read behind those. So dispersal, impact, likely related things. Whereas in New York, New York has similar questions to those, but the ecological impact side of things looks at everything from low impact to high impact. And sorry, I'm just seeing your question, Sarah, of what's the difference between a weed risk assessment and a plant risk assessment. And Jenica's answered that the weed risk assessment is the protocol. Plant risk assessment, yeah, I'm not even sure that there's a difference between a weed risk assessment and a plant risk assessment. So Jenica has a more definition than I've been thinking. I think of the two as somewhat synonymously. Okay, so criteria-based versus scoring. The different states, so the criteria-based happens in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Maine, where you have these sort of yes-nos. Point-based scoring, New York and New Hampshire both do that sort of range of scores for each of those different criteria rather than just the yes-no. Vermont, for us, it wasn't clear how the assessments actually translated into a recommendation for invasiveness for those species. So we didn't put that in a category. And then Rhode Island currently lacking. Another piece that we found in the analysis is that we're asking a lot of different questions in our weed risk analyses. So Emily and Lara spent a lot of time kind of going through all of the individual questions and trying to lump them together and categorize them. And they ended up with these sort of 7 major categories with almost 40 subcategories associated with those. The little X's underneath the states are the states that ask or have a question, related to that topic in the weed risk assessment. So this kind of shows that we're asking a lot of different questions, which could be a concern, right? Because if we want to be able to share information, then asking a lot of different questions across different states means that we might not have the information to share directly, to directly share that information. But one plus is that there are a lot of kind of key categories that are really consistent across the different states. So, for example, just about every state considers whether an invasive species has impacts on flora, fauna, or the native community. Every weed risk assessment considers dispersal mechanisms, so whether it's easy or hard for that species to disperse. Often life history traits, something that would, whether it's like rapid growth or how long it takes for that species to get to seed, to produce seeds, those types of things. And then everybody's interested in the distribution of those species, particularly whether it's present and or it has the potential to be present in the region, the potential or the existence of it being widespread in areas where it invades, and especially its presence in natural areas. So that's a big plus in terms of the potential for sharing information, because at least for these kind of key categories, everybody's evaluating those same pieces. But there are a couple of concerns here with the stars. So whether the species is naturalized in the state or whether it's widespread in the state, if the questions frame the question that way, then that could be a barrier to proactive regulation. So we looked a little bit closer at that question specifically to see, how those questions were framed and phrased, whether it would kind of prevent proactiveness. And so what we found was that in Connecticut, New York, and Vermont, the way that the questions were framed, it did not appear that sort of presence in the area or being widespread in the area would prevent proactive listing. So that's good. Although New York does have a question about climate matching, so whether the climate of New York is similar to the climate of the species in the home range. And of course, with climate change, since those different things are shifting, that could prevent some proactiveness. And then for Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire, it's not true actually that these questions are limiting proactive listing, because all of those three states have at least one species that's not yet in the state. But the framing of the question could be used to limit proactive listing. So for example, one of the New Hampshire screening questions asks, is the species currently established outside of cultivation as a non-native somewhere within the region of interest? And if the region of interest is defined as New Hampshire, then if the species is not yet present in New Hampshire, then that species would not be considered for potential regulation. Or is the species, known to be basically in natural areas within the region of interest? And again, region of interest is defined as New Hampshire. That limits our ability to be proactive. So some take-home points about the weed risk assessments themselves. The format and scope of questions in the weed risk assessments varies considerably across the different states. And that could hinder some data sharing, or at least make it harder to find, if you're in a state that has a lot of different questions, could make it harder to find that information already existing from a neighboring state's assessment. But some information, and I think we could also argue some of the most critical information about impacts, about spread, about the ability to naturalize and expand into natural areas in our region, those ones are pretty consistent across states. And so that piece, I think, really supports the idea that we could exchange information. There were also 4 states, which I didn't highlight in that in the list of different questions, but there were 4 states that also asked whether the species is identified as invasive elsewhere. And actually that criterion of invasive elsewhere is a common one in sort of weed risk assessments used for border patrol, or whatever the right word is, APHIS imports and stuff like that, right? So the species is invasive elsewhere, it's often considered a higher risk than a species not known to be invasive elsewhere. And so if a neighboring state has regulated a species, presumably that's because it is problematic and identified as invasive. And then lastly, the language of some states at least tends to prioritize species that are already present or already widespread in a state, and that could hinder proactive listing. All right, so the second question that we wanted to go into is looking at the species themselves. So what species have been evaluated and regulated in the Northeast? So this was a bit of a challenge for us, and we probably didn't get it exactly right. So Eve spent a lot of time kind of rummaging through and trying to figure out how we could kind of crosswalk or compare the different categories across different states, because we don't name things the same, and we also don't regulate the same set of species. But we did our best in terms of interpreting these different categories as high risk, moderate risk, potential risk, and low risk / we need more information about that species. And you can see with the little stars that depending on the state, some or all of these different categories end up actually on the regulatory list. So for example, in Massachusetts, the list of species that have been evaluated, there are ones that came out as invasive, likely invasive, and potentially invasive. But all three of those categories of species are regulated in Massachusetts. The same is true in Maine. In New York, for example, we have this high risk or very high risk, but as far as we can tell, not all of those high risk species are regulated in New York. Some of the moderate risk species are regulated, but only if they also pass sort of a socioeconomic criterion as well. So different categories that we have that we get it as an end result in terms of levels of risk. And so here's a graph of what we've actually evaluated across. Again, we had 4 states where we had the actual species evaluations. So for Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, and New York, we have evaluated 357 total species. So the range is 39 in Maine to 341 in New York. What's really interesting to us, though, is that even though, we've evaluated all of these different species, there are actually only 21 species that were evaluated by all 4 of those states. So because not only are risk assessments, a bit different and, unclear how that affects these sort of high to low rankings, but also the sets of species that we're actually choosing to evaluate are pretty different. And the net result of those two things of different ways of scoring and different evaluations and different sets of species that we're evaluating is that we have really pretty different regulated species lists. So if you look across New York and New England states, there are 228 total species regulated. In Rhode Island, this is the noxious seed law, so because Rhode Island doesn't have a plant list. But the percent of that, so 228 species that have presumably been identified as at least, some potential risk of invasive across this region based on those weed risk assessments. But we're just really not doing a great job of consistently regulating those species. So the highest score in here is Connecticut. So Connecticut is regulating 41% of those 228 species. Rhode Island is down at 5%. And the others are, in the 20s and 30%. So definitely painting this picture of, not a cohesive front against either our existing pool of invasives or certainly against the potential for range shifting invasives. And if we remember back to the weed risk assessment, so presumably because these criteria about impact, about dispersal, about the potential to exist in this region and be present in natural areas, because all of those were in our weed risk assessments, we can probably guess that this 228 number would be a good number for all of us to be aiming for, that those are all potentially high impact species that disperse easily and could exist within Northeast states. So we took another look a little bit closer at those 21 species. So if you remember, there were 21 species that all 4 states had evaluated. And if you look down the list of species, you'll probably recognize way more names than I recognize on that list. And kind of across the board on here, we've got a pretty good overlap for those 21 species. They tend to all kind of fall out in the high or at least moderate category across the 4 states. And this is consistent actually with another paper that we found that is similar to these efforts that was done for the Upper Midwest in 2016. And they evaluated a bunch of species that have been consistently scored across 4 or 5 Midwestern states, and found that all of those species kind of ended up at the high risk end of things. So that piece is good news. The problem, though, is that we kind of have no idea what's going on with the other 227 or 207, whatever the number is, 207 species. We don't know if this same level of overlap will be true for the less well evaluated species, right? I mean, if these are kind of the like classic worst case invasive species, then it makes sense that they would score as high risk across everybody. But if you've got these kind of ones in the middle or ones where we don't have all of the information that we would ideally need, then it's really unclear as to whether they would score consistently across the different states. So for those 21 species, or let's see, so there's 21 species, and this is just another map for those 21 plus another 10 that were ranked as that highest risk category in at least 2 states. So we ended up with 31 species, and this is just showing the number of those 31 species that are regulated in each of the states. So we've got species that are kind of consistently, or at least consistent across 2 states, often across 4 states, identified as like really high priority, really bad invasive species, and even those we're not regulating consistently. And we could argue actually in this case that this is an opportunity for northern New England to be more proactive. This could be an example of these really problematic species already having hit southern New England and not yet emerging in northern New England. That those might be kind of the first species that northern New England states want to look at. But this definitely kind of like begs the question of, well, what are the species that we should be evaluating? This is definitely a time-intensive process. So we can't just put 1 million species on the list and plan to evaluate all of them. So some ideas of what species we should be or could be evaluating could be any species identified by any state as high risk. So we have about 250 species that are identified as high risk by one state, about 100 species that have been identified as high risk by 2 states. And this is just an example of one of those. So paper mulberry is identified as high risk by New York, and based on some of the impacts assessments that we've done, but it's not regulated anywhere in the Northeast, and it's an ornamental tree with sort of hardiness zones that are at the warm edge of New England, but certainly falls within our, species that we could be more proactive about. So those are some example sets of species. We also have identified another 25 species that are range shifting that have major impacts on ecological communities based on the ICAT impacts assessment. And about 25 high-risk species. So we also looked down a little bit into the mid-Atlantic, so Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware, and looked through some of what they have as identified as high risk down there. There are about 25 species in the mid-Atlantic that are not regulated in the Northeast. So for example, here are a couple of them. These are high-risk species according to 2 or more mid-Atlantic states that have not been evaluated at all across the Northeast. So a bamboo species, Ludwigia grandiflora, is one of my case study invasive species because it's one of our range shifting ones that showed up as high impact from the impact assessment. So set of those different species. So take home points in terms of the evaluated species is that there's lots of different high risk or potentially high risk species out there, depending on how you kind of slice it, whether it's at least one state has identified it as high risk in the Northeast, any state in the Northeast or the Mid-Atlantic, the range shifting impacts assessment. We also know that there's more species coming, and so we're seeing this as kind of an opportunity, right? That with all of these species shifting in or starting to kind of expand in the region, then now is a really good opportunity for coordinating or thinking about how we do an evaluation of these high-risk species in a way that would be beneficial across the different states. And so that's where we're at right now. What we have been talking about in terms of directions that we on the kind of research team side are excited about going next are first to dig in a little bit more into the weed risk assessments themselves. So whether state risk assessments lead to similar or different assessments of risks. Basically, we think that we're going to get similar results for really well-known, like really the worst of the worst invasive species, but we really don't know if that's going to be true for the bulk of the pool of the remaining invasive species. And then a second thing that we'd be excited to work on is trying to dig in a little bit more on, a priority list of those high risk, something that's been identified as high risk by somebody across the Northeast. So can we narrow that down a little bit more, refine that list based on our different priorities and how we consider risk. And so I'm going to leave it with this discussion question. So we want to kind of shift into a discussion at this point. I am going to, I guess, leave this slide up for the moment. So these are just kind of some questions that we had of what you think would be useful at this point, what your hopes and goals are for either your risk assessments, like, we'd like to change them or we want to keep them as they are. We don't want to touch that. Your hopes and goals for what species could be evaluated and whether you think that different evaluations could kind of help or be, molded through your existing state risk assessments in any kind of practical way.